You're about to watch a video of church experience. If you would like to learn more, get connected, or help fuel the movement online, go ahead and click on the appropriate links there on our website.
Well, what's up, Rebels? We're getting into this second, third time doing this thing, so you guys kind of know where we're at. We're talking about the heart of a rebel. We're talking about the things under the surface that none of us like to deal with. So I want you to turn to the person next to you real quick, and I just want you to say, "What's up, Rebel?" Go ahead. Well, if you missed the first 2 weeks of this series, we began talking about pride, and pride being at the core of a rebel heart, and we talked about how humility is the key for kingdom greatness. And then last week we addressed what's the rebel's greatest struggle, which is pleasure, struggling with pleasure. Today we're going to really go after it, and we're going to talk about our possessions. When I was in high school, my parents had some friends that were really wealthy. I'm talking like they had millions. I don't know what was in their bank account, but they had a whole lot more than we did in our average family. In fact, we're probably a little below the normal average family when I was younger, and then they kind of progressed along in my family. Like in most of my growing up years, I would say is probably pretty normal, average, middle-class family. Well, when we left our normal, average home in an average neighborhood and we went on vacation, we went to South Florida, all the way from the Midwest, to stay at the home of our parents' rich friends. Now, they were so wealthy that they had a home in the Midwest and they also had a home down in South Florida. And so they said, "Why don't you guys come down and stay with us for free for a week?" So my parents jumped at that chance. They took me and my two little brothers, and we went down to this home in South Florida. It was right on the water, and it was probably the biggest home I'd ever been in to that point in my life. I walk in to the front of this house, walk in the front doors, and I look up, and around all over the second floor, there was this balcony that you could see up into all these different rooms. I have no idea how huge it was, but it was a massive home, spilled out back onto this huge patio with a large pool. The pool overlooked the water, and in the water was the yacht that they had. So I was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, this is unbelievable." They're kind of in a little intercoastal area. Like, it was just incredible. Not only that, they were kind enough to ask our family to go out on their yacht with them. Now, this yacht was not like, I'm not talking like a speedboat or a fishing boat. I'm talking like this was actually a yacht. Like, to get the idea of how wealthy this family was, they had a guy that worked for them, not their business, which they had a very successful business, but just for them personally. A guy worked for them, and his only job was to drive their boat. I could not get my mind around that. Like, as a high school student, I'm like, "Your job is to drive their boat? Like, how do I get that job, you know?" So, like, that's what he did, and, like, it was like a house on water. I mean, it was a massive, beautiful, huge thing, and me and my brothers were just, like, middle school, high school students, and we were just blown away, you know, and we're jumping off the side of the thing, and it was just a cool time. Well, that was a family vacation that we remembered that was really special, and they blessed us by allowing us to come stay in their home, and it was just a really unique, very different experience than what I grew up with. After vacation, we went home, and I walked in the doors of our very normal, average, common, everyday house, and I walked in, and it's like, okay, we're pretty poor in comparison to that family. You know what I'm talking about? Like, their transportation, yacht. Our transportation, I told you guys about our infamous stick shift minivan, right? So, I mean, it's like, it wasn't very glorious. I felt pretty poor in comparison to that family that I had spent some time with. It's funny how things change, though. 10 years later, still living a pretty common, normal, average, everyday life. And I go on a missions trip down to Mexico City. And I go to Mexico City with a few friends, and we're there for a missions trip. And I walk into the home of the family that we're staying with, and they were very, very, what you would really call poor. Walked into the bedroom, and that was a huge honor that I got to stay in a room by myself, but I got to have this room, and they said, "This is your room." And I went in and I lay down on the bed, and I looked around the walls, and there was holes and chipped out chunks of the plaster walls that had just been totally cut out, and there's just all these holes in the wall. And then this is the nice guest room that they're giving me, and the light bulb hung from the ceiling and loose electrical wires everywhere. I mean, it was very different than the home that I grew up in. I'll never forget the guy who got up early so that I could have a hot shower, and since they didn't have warm running water in their home, anywhere in their home, he had to get some normal water out of the faucet, put it on the stove, heat it up for quite a while. And when I woke up, I walked into this little space you could call a shower. It wasn't a shower, just like a little space that, built by bricks and a little curtain hanging there, and there's 2 buckets on the ground, and I'd dip 1 cup into the hot water and dip that then into the cool normal water, and that's how you would have a shower of the desired temperature. And that's the way they lived. That was normal. And I remember coming home from that trip, and I walked into my normal home, and I opened the door, and I was like, dude, I am rich. I am so rich. Same kind of experience, but from a different comparison. And I walked in, and I was thinking, man, we have painted walls, and there's no electrical wires hanging. There's no holes in the wall. Like, we have our driveways, like, paved. There's some men out the sidewalk out front of our house and pretty flowers. Like, that's rich. Like, we have this building attached. Maybe you have it at your house too, like, or the apartment where you live. There's like this attached building that's called a garage, and it's built just for our vehicle. It's like it's our own building just for our vehicle. Like, that's rich compared to what we came from and what we had just saw. And it's funny how what you compare yourself to determines how you feel about where you're at in life. And, we were poor and we were rich all in the same time, and just depended who we compared ourselves to. And preparing for this message, I read a book this last week called How to Be Rich by Andy Stanley. And in that book, he says something that's the first point in your notes if you'd like to write them down. In fact, there's a clipboard on your seat if you want to pull that out and write these notes down. I'd love for you to write this quote down. He says, "We're so absorbed in the effort to get rich, we no longer recognize when we are rich." We're so absorbed in the effort to get rich that we no longer recognize when we are rich. According to Andy, that there's a kind of a marker, you can call it a salary of about $37,000. And the average American who earns a salary would look at that salary of $37,000, and the average person in our country would look at that and not be real excited by that number. And for many, if not most, that would be a decrease in their pay for the average. So I don't know what your household, what the income is like, but that for a lot of people, they wouldn't get real excited about a job that offered that pay. Well, if you make $37,000 or more, congratulations, because you are in the top 4% of wage earners in the world. Out of the 7 billion-ish people in the world, the average wage earner makes less than $37,000. In fact, far less than that. So much so that 96% of the world's population, that would be an increase in their pay to make that much money in a year. So if you make that much or more, congratulations, you actually are rich compared to the world standards. What's further unique to our little window in time is that we have like the average Western culture work week, Monday to Friday, 40 hours a week. This is a unique time in history because throughout history, most people had to work all week long to have enough food, shelter, and clothing and health care to provide for themselves. And we get to work 5 days. The average person works about 5 days, and they have enough food for all 7 days. What's even more unique to our culture is that in some families of 3, 4, 5, 6 or more people, that one person can go out into the workplace and work a full-time job and provide enough food, health care, clothing, and everything that's needed to provide for a group of people. And that's very unique to our culture. Globally speaking, many people, they walk for hundreds of yards with a jug of water on their head or on their shoulder just so they have enough water for clean drinking or cooking. And they can't imagine a country like ours that's so wealthy that from house to house in the average neighborhood, there's so much extra clean water that we liberally spray it over our yards just to keep the grass a certain color. They can't imagine that kind of wealth. But for us, that's pretty normal in the way that we live. We had lived in an apartment our first year here in Florida, and our house in Michigan had sold, and so we were finally able to buy a house here in Florida, and we found a foreclosure we were really excited about. We got into it. It needed a little bit of work, but overall, it was a great house for us and our 4 kids, and so we got into it, and I loved a lot about it, but once I got in there, I realized there was one downside about this neighborhood and where it was at, is that the cell phone service that I had did not get reception in our neighborhood, which is kind of a big deal to not be able to get service. I had Verizon for a lot of years, switched to a cheaper provider to save money, and unfortunately, they didn't service our neighborhood. So I have to do what maybe some of you have done before. You call through Wi-Fi, so I can hook my phone up to the internet, and I can call when I'm at home through Wi-Fi. So it kind of functions the same, but the inconvenience is this. when I'm coming home and I'm driving into my neighborhood and I'm on a phone call, I had to pull up right into the edge of the neighborhood where we live, and I had to park next to one of the neighbors' houses, and I'm sitting there on the street finishing my phone call because if I drive all the way to my house, I'll lose them in the middle of the call, right? So sometimes it's an important call, so I pull in there and I'm waiting, and I can't imagine what they're thinking. It's like, why does this guy always park out in front of our house, you know? It's a creeper, you know? It's like, all right, I got to go. And so I hang up, and then on the other hand, it's equally inconvenient. I'm at home, I'm on an important phone call, but we got to run out to go somewhere. I got to be somewhere at a certain time, and I'm not wanting to be rude and rush someone off the phone, but I know that if I don't go now, I'm going to be late, and so I have to hang up before I go because the phone's going to cut off as I'm driving out my neighborhood. Inconvenient problem, but you know what that is? That's a rich person problem. And maybe you can relate, because if you have bad cell phone service, that's a rich person problem. If you have to wrestle with car repairs, that's a rich person problem. Slow internet or computer crashes, that's a rich person problem. Walking down the grocery store aisle trying to decide what I'm going to eat, I just cannot decide. Frosted Flakes or Golden Grahams, Lucky Charms, I just don't know. Like, that's a rich person problem. And you know what's crazy is that people around the world wish that they had those problems. I got to get an oil change. I don't know if I can afford to get the new tires I need. Man, that we have a vehicle, that's a rich person problem. Someone messed with me a little bit on the way out of the first service this morning, and they said, man, I got a rich person problem from you that happened to us this last week, and their family. This is what they said. They said the heater of the pool, something got messed up, and it heated their pool up, and it got up above 100-degree temperature. So the kids, they didn't want to swim because the pool was too hot. He's like, that's a rich person problem. I'm like, I agree with you. Sounds like you got yourself a rich person problem. You and I are rich, we just don't realize it. And as Andy said, we're so busy trying to get rich that we don't realize that we already are. One of the reasons we don't realize we already are rich is because rich is a moving target, right? Rich is a moving target. It's always someone else who has more or has something better or different than us. That's what rich is. It's something better, bigger, different. And so we're driven by discontentment. Gallup conducted a poll, and they said that they did a study of different socioeconomic groups. And they asked them to define what rich was. And for each and every person who defined rich, it was always roughly double the amount possessed by the person defining it, almost every single time. People who earned $30,000 a year said, if I would earn about $60,000 a year, I would be rich. People who earned about $50,000 a year said, if I earned $100,000 a year, then I would be rich. See, rich is a moving target. No matter what you have, it's always the next stage, the next season, the next a little bit more. That would be then when I would feel rich, or I would have arrived, or I have what I need. So here's the question. What's the cure? What's the antidote from this continual thirst and hunger and lust for more that leaves us empty, that leaves us dissatisfied, that leaves us driven by discontent? What is it that will finally allow us to enjoy what we have and where we are? 1 Timothy chapter 6, in verse 6, God speaks to this because he knows it's a struggle that we have in our humanity and our rebel ways, that we wrestle with discontentment, and so he speaks to this. Verse 6 of 1 Timothy 6, he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. Would you just help me out and say real loud? Would you just say contentment? Godliness plus contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Everybody say content. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So it's a trap to want to be rich, to focus on that, to the desire, the love of money is a root of all kinds of destruction in our lives. It causes so many problems, it causes so much pain. And it can be a trap if we focus on it, if that's what we're driven by. You know, our needs and our wants are so easily intermingled and intertwined. It's so hard to discern, especially in our highly developed and privileged culture that most of us in this room were born into. Only by the grace of God, it's hard to discern what a need is and what a want is. And we think we need so much, but a lot of it's really a want because we already have so much more than what most people have around the world. So contentment, finding this space where you can have joy in what you have, whatever you do have, is a God-given gift to allow us to enjoy where we're at. That doesn't mean you have to stay there. It doesn't mean you can't work hard and set goals and all that. But it means finding joy now instead of placing joy in next. Because if joy is always in next, that's called destination disease. I'll be happy if and when, and you'll never be happy then because there'll always be a next. There'll always be someone who has more. There'll always be something greater, bigger, better down the road. So finding contentment is a gift from God, and I put it this way in your notes. If you'd like to write this down, I think hopefully these things will help you. One is contentment is about managing what we already have with gratefulness. Contentment is about managing what we already have with gratefulness. You know the difference between appreciation and depreciation, right? It's pretty simple economic terms. You know, if you buy a car and you buy it for $10,000 and you drive it for 5 years, the value depreciates over time. You know, get a few dings in the Walmart parking lot, you know, spill a few things on the seats, you know, add a few 10,000, 100,000, 200,000 miles to the thing. And over time, it depreciates in value. And you might sell it for $2,000, $3,000, trade it in, something like that. That's depreciation. Appreciation is the opposite. You buy your first home, and maybe it's $100,000 or $200,000 or whatever you buy a home for, and you purchase the home, and that's what it costs you, and 5 years later, 15 years later, you sell it, or you get an appraisal just to get curiosity to see what it's worth, and it's gone up in value, 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever. Depends on how long you own it, depends on all these other factors, but it appreciated and went up in value most likely. It's interesting that word appreciation. That if we could look with appreciation on what we already have, and you look at that person that's in your household, lives under the same roof, or that you work with, and that friend in your life, and maybe you realize when you start to view them through the lens of appreciation that they've actually depreciated in value without you knowing it. You've neglected the relationship. You've taken it for granted. They're just in my life. They're just kind of coexisting. They're there, and you forget what a great gift they are, and you look into their eyes, and say, wow, man, this is a gift, and you start to appreciate what you have. And when you appreciate them, their value rises, and you're like, wow, this is actually a gift. I'm so thankful for this person, and appreciation raises the value. Or you look at that vehicle that you drive, and instead of always, I wish I had a bigger, better, whatever, nicer. Man, and I'm really grateful I have a vehicle that works and runs and gets me where I need to go, and I'm very thankful, and it appreciates, it raises the value. And sometimes when you do that, you realize that when you appreciate something, you're just appreciating it back to the value that it really was meant to have and that it always had. But you allowed it to depreciate, and so you're restoring what is actually inherent inside it. This is especially true in relationships and in our possessions when you compare to the average around the world that we have so many of the basics. I mean, you get it. And the idea is not to make us feel bad about what we have in our country or what you may have or don't have. It's because guilt doesn't drive good decision making. It doesn't drive good change of behavior. It's gratitude that changes us. And it's to realize, God, I am so grateful. This is a get to. I have so much that you've poured in, and I'm so thankful. Contentment changes us, and that's why it says that in your notes, that it's about managing what we already have and doing it with gratefulness. You know, when you think of something you want, it's a challenge, but could we think instead of something that we already have? You know, Andy Stanley said it's about what we do with what we have that matters, not what we do or don't have. And we so often think about what we do or don't have, and it's about what we do with what we already have. And Jesus was very clear on this. In fact, in Luke chapter 12, there's a very interesting story. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. Jesus says, the Bible says here, and sometime someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So hold on, let me stop there. So there's these guys, apparently their dad died or something like that, and one of the brother, probably the older brother, had the rights or somehow had the keys to the kingdom in the family and was able to take the wealth. And the one brother's upset about it because he didn't get his fair share. Maybe big brother gave him a little cut under the table and said, "All right, be happy, move along. I'm taking the home and I'm taking the cattle and all that." And little brother's upset about it. And so he looks around and Jesus, he's a leader, he's a teacher, he's a man with authority. He goes to Jesus and he says, "Hey, Jesus, help my brother see that he needs to give me my fair share." You know, I'm kind of encouraged by this in a weird kind of way, to know that there's always been drama. You know what I mean? Like, don't you get discouraged by that sometimes, the people you work with or you live next to or in your own family, and there's always drama. It's like, really? Is it really that big of a deal? Well, there's always been that way. It's in our rebel heart, this self-centeredness. I want more for me. And these two brothers, they're battling over what remains from their father's estate, and I want more for me. And how does Jesus respond to this very interesting And a somewhat humorous dilemma. Verse 13 of Luke chapter 12. In verse 14, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Life is not found in the abundance of possessions." And he told them this story, this parable. "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. It's been a good year.' He had an increase. More came in than what was expected or what was normal. And he's feeling pretty good about that. There's all this surplus. 'What should I do? I have no place to store my crops.'" Verse 18. Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, 'You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy.'" We're going to stop here. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, wouldn't it be cool if that was the end of the story? Because it's like happily ever after, right? Things went really well, so I got a surplus. I'll just tear down my barns, and when I have it, I'll just build even bigger ones, and then we're good to go. I mean, life's good. He's rolling in. It's like just happily ever after right there. It was a good story. The end. Thank you, Jesus. That's a good bedtime story. I feel good. But that's not where the story ends. Verse 20, Jesus goes on. He says, "But God said to him," this rich man, he says, "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." Jesus is saying it's not wise to spend your days just consuming and collecting. Consuming and collecting do not fulfill you, and that's not what you were created for. He says, "This night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get what you've stored up for yourself?" It's interesting to think about, and it's not fun, so we don't spend a lot of our days thinking about it, but all of our lives are going to come to an end this side of eternity. We're meant to live forever in paradise, where there's literally streets of gold we read about in the Bible. I mean, the true riches are yet to come, and that's exciting to think about. But here and now, we like to be consumed with the moment. We don't think about how this life is temporary, that we will die, and so whatever we collect, whatever we gather and amass, we don't get to take with us. It's very temporary. It's very finite. It's in this world. Being rich is not easy. Managing it for a higher purpose is what we were called and created for. What we do with what we have is determined by our view on our wealth and who owns it. Who owns it? And that's why I put this in your notes. I'd love for you to write this down, is that God owns it all and he lets us manage. This is the view that I see throughout the Bible, is that God owns it all and he lets us manage. It's not my stuff, my house, my car, my money. It's God's and it's his, and we get to manage it. We remember in gratitude to be thankful that God gave us life. He gave us the ability and the health to work. We worked, but he gave us the ability. We took the opportunity, but God provided the opportunity. It was all thanks to him. I hadn't been in a car accident in like 10 years, and I'd felt pretty good about my driving record and in that sense. And man, I was cruising towards a red light and just driving down the road. I'm slowing down. I stopped the vehicle, and I'm waiting for a while, so I messed with my phone or something. And this is a few years ago. I was living in the Midwest at the time, messing with a few things. I look up, the car in front of me starts to go. So I'm like, all right, we're moving forward. Unknown to me, someone ahead of me had just turned right, and so we're all moving up 5-10 feet. I'm thinking we're all going, so I hit the gas, and I start moving ahead, and I think, okay, we're going. I got a second, so I just turned away for a second to whatever I was doing, finishing that, and I just looked away from the road for just long enough to hear that sound that you hate to hear if you've ever had that sound while you're driving a car, and that's the crunch, the horrible crunch and crash of a car accident. And I slammed into the person in front of me, ruined their day, but messed up my day because, man, I was so disappointed. I sat there in the car seat, and again, this is a few years ago, but I can still see it clearly. I sat there, and I just felt like a failure. Pulled into the lot off the main drag, and I sat there, and I just took my face, and I put it in my hands. And I'm probably sure I said things I shouldn't have said, like, I am such a failure, and I can't believe I did that, and I was just beating myself up. Well, it's worse than that. It's worse than what you're imagining, just that horrible feeling that you wrecked a car and someone else's car. It was way worse than that. Because the car I happened to be driving on that specific day, after not having an accident in like 10 years, was not my own car. it was a good friend of mine named John. And John was a guy, he's a leader in our church that I was pastoring at the time. And John had said so graciously, he's like, hey, man, I'm a mechanic. You have a car issue. Let me take your car. I'll fix it. You just pay me a very cheap price and the parts and all that. And I'll fix your car for you. And why don't you take the keys to my car for a couple of days? You take my nice truck, very nice truck. I mean, he's a car guy. You know, it was a very nice. They take my truck. You drive it for a couple of days, and we'll trade off when I'm done fixing your car. John, thank you. That's so nice. I'm driving this truck around town, trying to take good care of it. And I felt like a failure because I messed up something that wasn't mine. But then, man, it got worse, and I'm not kidding you. I think it couldn't get any worse at that point, and it did. Because I stepped out of the car when the police officer arrived, and I get out, kind of explain the situation, apologize. But unfortunately, the guy that got out of the police car, the only good thing about it was that he didn't give me a ticket. And the only reason why he didn't give me a ticket is because he attended our church. And he gets out of the car, and I'm like, I just officiated that guy's wedding a few months ago. And he's walking towards me, and he's got a big grin on his face. And it's the kind of grin like, I'm going to tell everybody and their mother about this. It's so humiliating, man. But, I think my heart dropped a little bit because it was someone else's property that I had not managed well. I didn't take care of it. It was entrusted to me. And one day I'm going to stand before God. And God's going to say, I trusted you with these people that were in your life, these relationships first and foremost. I entrusted you with this certain amount of resources that were in your life and whatever. What did you do with it? Because it was his, and I get to manage it. We manage it. God owns it. We're managers of the wealth that he brings into our lives. And we may agree with this in principle, but oftentimes we disagree in practice because when God asks of us to be generous and we see a need, which you guys have been incredible to meet needs. I love the things we've been able to do as a church. When there was that family whose house burned down, I mean, we're 4 months old, and you guys have already done so much. Their family's house burned down a couple months ago, and you guys brought so much stuff that we literally filled a truck up to the point where they said, okay, we're good. We don't need anything else. You guys provided, I think it was like 1,100 meals, and we donated food to RCS a couple weeks ago. You guys just brought table load of food and resources. We've been able to give money to 5 other church plants, even though we're a brand new church ourselves. We've been able to give money to World Hope International. We bought the 100 chickens through World Vision and provided wealth and resource and income for people who are in poverty. And there's so much, and there's more, a lot more, helping about a dozen people who are in need within our own body in different ways. You guys have done a lot. You've become a generous group of people. And I'm really proud of us for that. But the challenge sometimes is that when are we generous enough? Are we really generous? Is leaving change at the gas station for the person next to us, is that generous enough? Is giving $2 to the homeless person generous? Does that mean I'm a generous person? How do we know? What's like the benchmark? And I think sometimes we disagree in practice when God asks of us to be generous, this idea that he owns it all, because we believe in our mind that he owns it all, but in our heart, it's so difficult to make the act of generosity because we still believe that it's ours and we hold on to it instead of, God, I hold this loosely because it really is all yours. So what do you want me to do with it? And instead of asking God what he wants us to do with what he's given us, we ask, what do I want to do with what I have? And the premise behind that is it's all mine. It's all mine. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9. It says this, it says, honor the Lord. So important, that word honor. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. It says, first you honor the Lord. And if we think about ways to be generous and to honor God and to live for him, I think there's at least 3 different types of generosity and giving that we can find in the Bible. There's 3 different types of ways to help fight off the self-centeredness and this gravitation towards greed that's in our rebel hearts. And one, if you want to write these down, there's just 3 quick ones. They're really easy. One is priority giving. When it says honor the Lord with your wealth, we put him first. He's the number 1 priority. And this is really a statement. This is really a statement of whose I am and who owns what I have in our possessions. It's where we let go and we say, God, I'm going to honor you first. You're the priority. And when we set the priority straight in this most difficult area of our life, and there's a reason why this is the 3rd week of this series, because sometimes it's one of the last things to go in our spiritual journey with God. It's one of the hardest things to let go and entrust to him in our heart. But when we set our priorities right, even in a difficult area like our possessions, and we put God first, we honor him even with our wealth and with our generosity, it puts other things in our life in the correct and proper order. So priority giving. Malachi chapter 3 is a well-known verse on this topic. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. It says, will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are you robbing me? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, the whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. The only time that God says in the Bible, test me in this, he says it about our possessions. He says, you can actually test me in this. Go ahead, try it for a few months, honor me with your wealth, and see if I don't open the floodgates, if I don't provide for you and affirm for you in your heart that you're doing the right thing. It's a question of, is our wealth really his when we put him first? My parents taught me this from the time I was a young kid. I always kind of worked, and so when I was really young, I had a paper route, and then I worked in customer service, and I washed cars, and I had my first legit job at 16 years old. I worked full-time in a furniture factory over the summer. And I got up at 6, or had to be there at 6 a.m. and I worked and I got a paycheck. And my parents taught me, when you get a paycheck, Brandon, if you get $500, take that first tenth and take that tithe means tenth, and take that first tenth and give it to God. Give it back to him for the advancement of his kingdom, to do good and help others and tell others about the love of God. And give that to him. Set that aside. Take the next tenth and save it. And live on 80%. And they said, Brandon, don't do what most of our world does, and that's live on 105 or 100% or 110% of what actually comes in, and always be overextended and in debt and all that stuff. Don't do that. And so that brings us to the second kind of giving that I know my parents taught me, and that's percentage giving. So not only priority giving and generosity and putting God first, but percentage giving. God notices the amount, but he notices more the amount of sacrifice. And so how do you measure that? How do you know if you're being generous? How do you know if you're being generous compared to someone else or your own situation in God's eyes? How do you know? Well, there's another very brief but interesting story I want to read to you in Mark chapter 12, verse 41. It says this. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were being put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins worth only a few cents. And I can imagine the people when Jesus is telling this story, like what they're expecting him to say and what he actually says, which would be so different. He's like, so there's a bunch of rich people coming along, and they gave a lot of money to God, and they put it in the temple. And all the people in the crowd are like sitting around listening to Jesus tell the story, and like, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, way to go. It's like, and then he's like, and then a widow came along, and she gave 2 cents. And they're like, well, that's cool. A little tip for God. That's great. But that's not what Jesus points out in the story. Verse 43 says, calling his disciples to him, his followers, he said this, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. So God's math is a little different than ours. Verse 44, they all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. What was Jesus highlighting? He was highlighting that it's about the heart. It's not about the amount. And I think you could put it in our terms, it's about the percentage of how generous are you? How generous are you? Because this woman who had very little gave more, in Jesus' words, than those who were really wealthy, even though they gave a large amount and was technically more. It was more in God's eyes what she did. She lit up heaven's radar because of her generosity. The percentage is more important than the sum, and this standard viewpoint of the Bible that you see all through the Bible, this kind of like baseline is like this idea of giving God a tithe, which is a tenth, giving him a tenth and putting it first. The first thing that we do when we write a budget is putting that in there and say, this is the first thing we're going to do, and we're going to honor God in it. And then third is progressive giving. So priority giving, percentage giving, and progressive giving. One study that I read came across this. It said that people, as they go on and they get wealthier, they actually become less generous. By and large, people as they get wealthier are less generous. And so what that means is that if you make $40,000 a year and you tithe, you give a tenth of that, and you gave God over the course of 12 months, you gave him, and were generous, $4,000. That's a lot of money. But imagine if that person who did that, and let's say they were in their 30s or 40s, and they had a good job, and they progressed, and they moved into management or something, and they got paid a whole lot more, and that doubled to $80,000. Maybe they made $100,000. And that same person who was very generous with the $4,000, now they give more. They might give $6,000 or $7,000, but they don't give what they used to give based on how much they make, because, man, 10% of $100,000 is $10,000. That's a lot of money. And it calls into question our faith and trust in God. We tell ourselves that we're giving more when the amount goes up. When we get a raise, we can give a little more, but sometimes we're becoming less generous, and the only way to know that is to pull out a calculator and find out, am I being generous? As God blesses us Will we give and be generous in the way he's blessed us? After I got in the accident, it was probably a few days, a week later, and I was still a little bummed about it, that the cars had been repaired, things had been made right, but in my heart, the residual is still there of what I did. And we were leaving to go drive somewhere, and the kids went and got in the car, and Jennifer was out in the garage before me, and she said, "Hey, Brandon, come check this out." And so I go to the garage, and as I'm walking out the door into the garage, she says, "I had nothing to do with this." Okay, so when you hear that, your ears perk up. You're like, okay, what's going on? So I walk out into the garage, and there are my two boys, and they're a little younger than they are now, but they were in the back seat, and they had their bike helmets on. And I'm like, "Why do you guys have your bike helmets on?" And they're like, "Well, in case you get in another accident." It's like, made sense to them. It's like, Dad crashed up the car, and if it happens again, I don't want. They had lost faith in their dad's ability to protect them. They just lost faith in me to protect and provide for them. I wonder how many of us have lost faith in God to provide for our needs, to provide for even our wants, our desires. We talked about this some last week when we talked about pleasure, but ultimately our desires are truly and most deeply fulfilled in the Lord. And we talked about how he gives us the desire of our heart, which is ultimately him. He is what we were created for, and he is the real desire of our heart, and nothing is as fulfilling as him. And when we put him as priority in our life, and as we honor him in our lives, it's a question of, do I really trust God to meet my needs, to fulfill my desires in my heart, which are ultimately him? I want to close by reading this one last verse, and it's from Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, verse 36. Jesus asked, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" He says, if you did gain everything in this world, everything of this world, if you gained everything, but you forfeit your soul, what do you actually win? What do you actually get in the end? Because this world is finite. It's limited. We're all going to stand before God and give an account for what we did in this life that we have. We all will die. What we have in this world is only an illusion of the true riches that are to come. So here's my challenge for an encouragement for us. Live for the Lord. Don't live to get rich. Don't let that be the focus of your life, because that will disappoint you. One day, which we all unfortunately will in this life, when you're lying on your deathbed, when you're taking your last breaths, if you live to get rich, you will live with regret, because you will see in that moment, if not the moments leading up to that it wasn't worth it, that did not fulfill, that's not what you were created for, and looking on the edge of eternity, that's not what mattered most. At the end of our life, we will be grateful that we lived with open hands. God, it's yours, that we lived with generosity, and that we lived with contentment in every season. Even as seasons progressed throughout life, we lived in that season with a sense of joy and purpose and meaning, and we lived with gratitude. Thank you, God. I'm truly rich in your sight. Even if I have very little and I don't have enough of what I think I need, I'm grateful and I'm content in that. And my hope is that we'll walk in that generosity and we'll walk in that contentment every day. And in so doing, God will bring fulfillment into our lives, and he will be on the throne of our lives. Right on? Hey, let's pray together. Hey, God, thank you so much for the amazing act of generosity that you began when you gave of your own son, Jesus, for us. You gave everything for us. And how could we not return to you, God, our gifts of gratitude and generosity? Father, I pray that, I know this is a hard topic for many of us, because all of us, probably week to week, we in some way have to deal with and interact with and think about how the bills are going to be paid and how it's going to work out. And there's a certain amount of managing and investment that has to happen for all of us. But God, I pray as we work through that you would give us wisdom and discernment to know how to put you first in that, and to how to put you as the priority, and to honor you, and to live generous lives, live lives that we are fulfilled by and that you are pleased with. God, I pray that each of us would live with generosity, but I pray that we'd also live with contentment. That God, as we walk out of here, that we wouldn't feel guilty that we've been given such a gift to be in this country that's so developed, and that we, even though we may feel like we have little in comparison to what we might call rich, that God, compared to the world's standards, every one of us in the room are incredibly rich. And God, because we have your son Jesus in our lives, we are so rich eternally. And so that's why we say with confidence that the best is yet to come, because we believe, God, that you have true riches that are lasting and eternal for each of us. And God, you've poured them into our lives even now through your presence. And so we're so grateful. We pray as we leave here, we leave with contentment, we leave with joy, and we leave with gratitude. It's in Jesus' name we pray. And everybody say, amen.
Thanks so much for watching this video of Church Experience. We are so glad that you joined us. If you would like to get connected, learn more, or help fuel the movement, go ahead and click on the appropriate link on the website there. We're so glad that you watched this video, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.